Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Australian launch of an extraordinary new book, The Hidden Power of Systems Thinking by Ray, Ison, and Ed Straw. I'm Cynthia Mitchell. I'm a Distinguished Professor of Sustainability at the Institute for Sustainable Futures at UTS, and it's my pleasure to be the MC for today. Wherever in the world you are tuning in from, you are on the lands of ancestral people. Here in Australia, it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional owners of the land on which I stand today. I'd like to pay my respects to them as traditional custodians of the wisdom and knowledge of this place. And I'd like to pay my respects to the elders, past, present, and emerging. Let me give you an overview. As you might expect, for a book like this, our intent today is not just to introduce the book, but also, of course, to engage and to catalyse each of you. Currently 61 participants. We're looking at doubling, if not tripling that, as people come online, to work out how you can help initiate and then sustain a conversation as well as action about reinventing governance systems here in Australia and the region that are fit for dealing with the climate emergency and the other crises we face. That means we're using the meeting function, which means we need you, of course, to mute yourself at all times, except for the breakout groups, and we thank you for your participation there. So to meet that intent of ours, we've structured the event in two. The first half is focused on the authors and the panel, and the second half is focused on you, the participants. I'll introduce the authors and panel members in a moment. They'll speak for about 40 minutes. And I'll be managing the time closely, as they know. Then we'll move into a question framing session and a question answering session, and we'll wrap up bang on time. So let me, without any further ado, move into the introductions. ISF's commitment to systems thinking and improving governance goes right back to our very beginnings. So it is opportune to bring these two strands of our work together today. I'm honoured to introduce Bob Carr, our industry professor for business and climate change at UTS. He is, of course, formerly the New South Wales Premier and the Federal Minister for Foreign Affairs. Our association with Bob goes all the way back to 1997, when Bob officially launched ISF at the Australian Technology Park. He is now instrumental in curating and hosting the UTS for Climate initiative, a series of In Conversation events with leading politicians, economists, journalists, and researchers. Welcome, Bob. Our history with Ray Ison is almost as long as Bob's. Ray is Professor of Systems at the Open University in the UK and an adjunct professor here at ISF. Ray has been helping us deepen our knowledge and practice of systems since the early 2000s, when he came to a postgraduate retreat and inspired us to think differently. Ray is globally renowned and respected across the systems community, and he's a past president of the International Systems Science Society. Welcome, Ray. We are delighted to welcome Thea Snow. Thea is the Director for Australia and New Zealand at the Centre for Public Impact. Thea's experience spans the private, public, and not-for-profit sectors. She's worked as a lawyer and a civil servant, and with Nesta, the Innovation Foundation in the UK. Recently, she joined the CPI, and there she leads the Reimagining Government initiative. So we're very much looking forward to your contribution today. Thanks, Thea. Finally, we have Ed Straw. Ed is a visiting fellow in the Applied Systems Thinking in Practice group at the Open University in the UK. Our welcome for Ed needs to be particularly warm because he joins us from the UK, where it's about 3 in the morning. Thank you, Ed. Ed has spent a career lifetime in and around government as advisor, consultant. He was a partner and global and UK board director for PwC, as well as think tank author, chair of national charities, activist, citizen, and of course, consumer. He says his first degree in civil engineering instilled the discipline of designing things, now including governments, such that they don't fall down. So, ladies and gentlemen, we are in for a treat. Let me spend a couple of minutes setting the scene. We are very excited to bring together these 4 brilliant minds today with all of your brilliant minds. And in preparation, of course, I've been reading the book, and I have to say it's the most potent distillation of damn good ideas that I've come across in a very, very long time. There are absolute pearls of practical wisdom and insightful stories peppered throughout every chapter. And so I have to fess up, I haven't read the whole book, because what happened is every time I dipped into it, I found such richness that literally I could only manage about 10 pages before I needed to stop and think, and go away for a little while, make sense of what I was reading. So I was writing down terrific one-liners from the book as I came across them, thinking, you know, in this role, I could use them to kind of introduce things. And my list got very long, very rapidly. There's so much to praise. The one-liner about how it might be the English language that kills us, or about how losing our ability to laugh at our politicians, as we have done here in Australia historically. I don't know if anyone else remembers Max Gillies or John Clark. It's actually much more serious than we think. And the absolute cut-through metaphor about how systematic is solid and systemic is fluid. I could go on. And even though it's difficult to choose one above all the others, and perhaps even dangerous to do so, I'm going to jump in. My favourite was about how Ray and Ed caution us all to act with humility and to recognise it is the system that is at fault, not the people in it. They say that if we were politicians, we would fail in this system too. So with that as a setup, it is my pleasure to hand over to Bob to officially launch the book in Australia and to comment on what it takes to reinvent governance in Australia so it's fit for dealing with the climate crisis that we face. Over to you, Bob.
Thank you, Cynthia. So while we talk here today, we know that methane is pluming from disintegrating permafrost in the Antarctic. We know that great sheets of ice in the north and south of our planet are disintegrating. We know that the fires in California were unprecedented, as the fires in our last summer were unprecedented. I could go on, but people plugged in to our discussion today are aware of the symptoms of the climate emergency. It is a climate emergency. Any approach to the challenge of governance in Australia and climate has got to begin with what happened in the Australian Parliament in late 2009. We've got to analyse that. We've got to pick over that. There was presented to the Parliament legislation that would have priced carbon. It was hugely consequential, for example, to the coal-fired power generators, especially in Victoria. The leader of the coalition, the Conservative coalition, was committed to supporting it. But while he was negotiating with the federal Labor government of Kevin Rudd, there was a hollowing out of his party by people who are importing to Australia. We know this from Marion Wilkinson's recent book, Carbon Club, the ideas of climate denial that were taking hold with money from the carbon lobby of Republican thinking on this issue in the United States. All outlined in Marion's book, about which I interviewed her for the ISF climate conversation that's available online. The Green Party made a decision, still assuming continued bipartisan support for measures to price carbon into the future, that it could hold out for, let's say, a more perfect system than that proposed by Rudd for pricing carbon. The result is that as a result of this climactic clash in the Parliament, a clash of interests and values, Australia rejected what had been, up till then, seen as a consensus position that would enable us to price carbon, one that John Howard, in principle, had been committed to in 2007. And since then, in the 13 years since then, in the 11 years since then, we've been torn by dispute that has left this unresolved. Australia has not made a commitment to net zero emissions by 2050. In standing out on this, if we're looking at the election of a Biden government in 2 weeks' time, we're going to be quite isolated. We're going to be with Brazil and Saudi Arabia. So here's my challenge. are there new approaches to systems, to governance, that would have presented Australia with a more just and timely outcome in 2009 than that climactic failure of policy and politics, which means in 2020, Australia hasn't opted to price carbon. There are very potent ideas in this wonderful book. The notion that any constitution should commit to, above all, to the biophysical world being incorporated as a central part in our governing system. Where does a constitution say that? Think about it. That's the freshest concept that might be found in these pages. I love the section on water. Access to drinkable water, a fundamental human right. As Premier in my first years, I got a phone call from the laboratories of Sydney Water saying cryptosporidium and giardia were found. Carr, you've got to get on radio and television and tell the people of the people of Sydney that even cooking their vegetables in water is a danger to their health. I found myself in the toughest press conference that was imaginable, telling people this, but saying, you have got an absolute right to drink water from your tap. The system's failed. We're going to find out what went wrong and fix it up. I said that because I'd heard a French citizen say to me on a visit to Paris, she thought French citizens, had an absolute right to be able to drink water from the tap that was safe and compatible with good health. The winning example here, Flint, Michigan. The people lost their access to clean water as a result of a probably corrupt decision made by their state governor about privatisation and giving a largely black population inferior, compromised water so bad it was injurious to the health of their children. Flint, Michigan makes the case, and that was in a developed country. Looking at the reminder in these pages of the value of referenda, plebiscites, practiced, of course, in California and Switzerland, Proposition 14, Proposition 22. Whenever you go to California, it seems there's a referendum on a consequential subject, not always with results that are good for governance, it could be argued. I did find myself thinking of what I might have submitted to the people, maybe the decision to allow hotels to install poker machines, for example, would have been ideal for a citizen's debate and decision with a plebiscite rather than legislation in the parliament. We've got to confront, as we look at this, at the issues Kevin Rudd, former Prime Minister, raised in a feature article, an opinion article, I should say, in Nine Media yesterday about the power of the Murdoch media. Right now, a major block on the necessary action to meet the climate challenge is represented by the fact that 70% of the media in Australia is owned by an American citizen who, as confirmed in the recently broadcast documentary, three-part documentary on Rupert Murdoch, says in the last moments of the third part in this documentary series, he disputes climate change. He thinks it's not an emergency. He thinks it's eminently manageable. And that view is entrenched by the uniform commentary to be found in the pages of those newspapers. And they dominate media in this country. Kevin Rudd argues provocatively, we're looking not at a media organisation, but a political party, the best way of considering an unaccountable political party, he might have added, the best way of considering, he says, the power of News Limited. Where do we find hope? Many ideas in this book can give us hope. I home in on two. Page 257. Which practice will you apply today? And they're laid out before us are challenges for us in our approach to problems, to use visual modeling to question assumptions, to see oneself in the system, to be aware of one's own mental model, to see the bigger picture. There are examples in the following pages of how we might be challenged to consider applying some of those concepts. So this is rich in ideas. Some of them are very relevant given this testing American election. The American Constitution, written in the 1780s, living with unintended consequences, like universally assumed gun rights. A commitment to freedom of thought and expression that is interpreted by the American Supreme Court to ban any attempt to control donations to political parties by major corporate interests. To ban those donations to political parties by big business, the Supreme Court argues, is a conflict with the First Amendment, which guarantees freedom of speech. I like the concept of voter registration at birth. Given that there are poor and coloured citizens of the United States who've got to fight against the odds to simply get onto the electoral roll, this is an important solution. So the book is, above all things, very timely, and it's a great honour for me to declare this volume bursting with ideas and with idealism and with a practical cast of mind, officially launched.
That's right. I think lots of rounds of applause. It was one of the, I mean, there are many things I miss, I guess, about this. We do that. There are many things I miss about not being able to do these kinds of things with people, and one of them is the feedback. Kind of apt for a systems piece, I think. Bob, thank you for leading by example yet again, talking about reflecting on one's mental model, and you doing that in practice, wondering about what plebiscite questions you might have chosen during your time as Premier. Thank you for your words of wisdom today. And Ray, I'm going to pass to you now to share with us something of the motivation for the book, what your intention was, you and Ed as authors, and to draw some relevance to the Australian context. Over to you, Ray.
Thank you very much, Cynthia. I extend my greetings to everyone from the historical land of the Wurundjeri people, and I acknowledge their elders past and present. Can I say how delighted I am to be hosted here by ISF, who I hold in the highest regard, and I'd like to extend my thanks to Bob Carr and Thea Snow for joining our panel today. This book is a distillation of 2 lifetimes, and I'm pleased to say it was a very happy collaboration. We worked extremely well together, and we had skills and understandings that complemented each other well, and I hope that if you get a chance to read the book, you'll see that manifest in the book. There are 2 ways to enter into this conversation, perhaps. One is to say, well, all that we do grows out of our own traditions of understanding about how we think and act. And we have an appendix in the book which explains in narrative terms how Ed and I came to the book and the sets of experiences that led us to say what we say. And so if you do pick up the book, I invite you to get to the appendix at some point. Cynthia hasn't probably got there yet, but she will, I'm sure. And I just want to perhaps highlight one experience of my own which gave rise to this, because ultimately what the book is trying to do is to give you a set of concepts and some heuristic devices to be able to talk about governance as if it were a system. And if I have one aspiration, particularly here in Australia at the moment, is that we can begin to question happens in our governance systems and have a much more sophisticated conversation about it than is currently the case. In 1994, I worked for the UK aid agency in a group of people running a consultancy in South Africa just after the apartheid election. We were invited to go to South Africa to help inform policy in 3 government ministries: rural development, agricultural extension and research, and land redistribution. I convinced the people who are funding this event that we could not possibly understand what was going on in such a dynamic moment in the history of South Africa. All we could do was to work with others in the situation, people who were going to govern South Africa, and help them think about what they might do and how they might design aspects of their governance system. We did that in a very innovative way, in which we call a sort of, I guess, a preemptive co-design or co-inquiry model, and ran a series of activities based on what we learned from going out through the country. And as I worked with my South African colleagues, white and black, I challenged them and said, what are you going to do when you move into government to ensure that the circumstances that gave rise to apartheid are not going to happen again? And they came back to me over drinks and said, well, what we're going to do is we're going to institutionalize funding to civil society such that we create a dialectic between civil society and the state. And it'll be out of this dialectic that we don't get the state falling into the trap of the apartheid government. Now, as I was there, the people I was working with were recruited into government. They became ministers, senior bureaucrats and other things, having moved from the activist NGO sector into government. And I could see, even before I left South Africa, this dream of what was possible fading from their eyes. And it was, to me, one of the great tragedies of my life that what they said needed to happen and should happen didn't happen. Because as they moved into government, the system of government, the rules of government, except with a few minor exceptions, captured them, and they began to enact what the system created the structures to do. So if we now jump from that period forward to now and pick up on riff off Bob's point, we now live in what some people describe as the Anthropocene. Well, if we accept the idea that we are in a world in which human-induced climate change is happening, that we are capable of changing whole Earth dynamics and have now been doing this for some time, then we must accept that we are essentially in a period new to human history. That we are a force of nature, and we have to therefore reflect critically on the rules of the game, the institutions, the practices that we humans have invented and put into place to govern ourselves. And that requires, in my view, everything being up for grabs. That's not to say we need to discard everything, and I'm not advocating a descent into anarchy here, but we do need institutions such as, for example, and this picks up on Bob's idea about carbon tax. If we had said and framed the issue back in 2009 as we are entering a very problematic and uncertain period, we don't really know what to do. Let us set up a national deliberative convention that inquires systemically into our future and our future life on this continent. And we will learn and inform the citizenry and the politicians about what we are understanding and how might be the best way to govern that. Then we would have institutionalized a way of co-evolving with an unfolding uncertainty. But we hang on, unfortunately, to our commitments to the idea that we can control the future and that we can predict it out of historical data. And we know, say, from hydrology, that stationarity is dead. The concept that we can now predict the future from the past is a questionable assumption. So what does our book do? Well, it starts with a simple heuristic model of trying to understand governance as a system. And if you can imagine 5 elements in this system at a meta conceptual level, well, of course, there's the state. And the state is made up of many components: the executive, the bureaucracy, et cetera, et cetera. It goes on, all the parastatals and everything that the state owns and does. Then, of course, there's the law, made up of, again, many practices, institutions, aspects and parts of the law. Then there is the private sector, and the private sector sits on a whole set of rules and assumptions that we humans have invented and which are becoming increasingly problematic. Then, of course, there is civil society. There's us and the organisations we invent and inhabit amongst ourselves. And there's a 5th one, which Bob has already referred to, in terms of the media. And the media floats around. Sometimes it's aligned with the state, as in China. Sometimes it's aligned with the private sector, as in the media barons that control the Australian media. And of course, there are some aspects of the media which are increasingly filtering into civil society, where social media enables certain things to be done, or does it? As the Social Dilemma has so potently showed as a documentary and on Q&A last evening, there are major, major problems with social media and technology. So one of the central arguments of our book is, how do you unpack that constellation of elements and understand, in the context you are in, whichever country you happen to be in, how are those elements hanging together? Should we be focusing on a new ICAC, a federal ICAC, without asking the question, where does that fit in the system of governance? If we just put it there, will it work? Is it likely to be effective? How do we orchestrate effective institutional innovation that is going to address the phenomena of concern? Cynthia, can you give me a buzz when my minutes just about
1 minute, Ray.
Good, thank you. The book goes on to posit that there are 3 fundamental things missing from our contemporary governance systems. Bob has already alluded to one. The central one is the biosphere. The biosphere is central to human existence and human flourishing. Yet we have historically treated this as the environment, something separate from us, and an externality, particularly through economic theory and economic behaviour. At long last, David Attenborough has said in his 93rd year that it's not the future of the earth that is at question, it is the future of us in relation to the earth that is the issue. And I commend you to his latest show to you. It's good, but it's a little too late in my view. The other thing that's missing is the technosphere. The social dilemma raises technological issues, but the social media is only one minute part of all of this. We have deposited 30 trillion tonnes of stuff on the face of the earth since we humans became a force of nature. And we continue to do that without an appropriate way of thinking about technology and its development, and leave it to laissez-faire capitalism to chart its course. And finally, and this is my last point, we allow a distorted and unsystemic political system to be our arbiter of social purpose. Voting once every 3 years, 4 years, or 5 years is not a sufficient way to devise and to orchestrate and to have a national conversation or an international conversation about social purpose. And so we need new institutions of social purpose. And in the book, we talk about aspects of how that might be done with constitutional conventions, deliberative processes such as the Irish abortion referendum, and the design of ways in which citizens might develop their active citizenry. So I'm going to leave it there and invite you to read the book. Hope you will, and I will, and Ed will be happy to respond to any questions that you raise or don't get answered in the session later. Thank you.
Ray, thank you. That was a very long minute, but I figure as lead author of the book, you're allowed. Just a couple of, to pick up a couple of things you said. Everything needs to be up for grabs. We are a force of nature. We need to develop the critical reflection skills that go with being a force of nature in order that we can co-evolve with the unfolding uncertainty that's ahead of us. Thank you, Ray. Thea, I'm going to ask you now to talk us through the Centre for Public Impact perspective and its works on reimagining government and how it relates to Ray and Ed's book, particularly in the Australian context. Thank you.
Thanks, Cynthia, and thank you so much for having me today. I'd like to also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I stand today, which is the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So I thought I'd actually begin with a story which explains the catalyst for why I chose to read this book. Amber, can I have the next slide, please? Earlier this year, the Centre for Public Impact partnered with the Australian New Zealand School of Government to deliver a webinar series on reimagining government. The webinar series explored a new paradigm for government, which we call the Enablement Paradigm, which rests on a vision which sees the role of government as being to enable communities and citizens to live their best lives. And to shift to this enablement paradigm, there are 5 key elements that we've identified. Governments need to take a relationships first approach. They need to share power. They need to think in systems. They need to lead with humility. And there needs to be a deep commitment to learning. And for those of you who have read the book, you'll see a lot of synergies between this list and the themes that emerge in Ray and Ed's book. And in each webinar series, we delved deeply into one of these themes. And then at the end, we had a final webinar which looked back over the series. And we asked the audience member to vote on which element of the enablement paradigm most resonated for them, which one felt most important. Interestingly, more than 60% of people said thinking in systems, but perhaps even more interestingly, one of the audience members offered this reflection. Amber, can you move to the next slide, please? I'll just leave you for a minute to read that. Of course, Ray is completely correct. This is not a discrete list of 5 elements. And it's this entanglement of the various elements that we at CPI are interested in exploring and experimenting with. One of the implications of this entanglement of the various elements is that systems thinking is about putting relationships first and leading with humility. Amber, can we move to the next slide, please? And what this demonstrates is that systems thinking and complexity-informed government isn't just about doing things differently, it's about new ways of being. It isn't about bringing a bunch of highly trained system experts who are really proficient at doing stock and flow diagrams and system dynamic modelling, although I'm sure there are people who think that would be great. It's more about imbuing government and people who work in and around government with new sensibilities. Complexity-informed government is about helping government see and understand the world and their place within it differently and behaving differently as a result. Next slide, please. In the book, Ray and Ed speak a lot about the critical role that framing plays in supporting systems thinking in government. And I love this quote: "What is understood as a wicked or tame problem is a matter of boundary choice. Change the boundary and the system in focus changes, as does its purpose. Boundary expansion is an imperative in all future governance and governing innovation." Can we move to the next slide? At CPI, we work with government agencies to help them understand that current approaches, which are about control and accountability and efficiency, and what Ray and Ed call a systematic approach, are largely a result of a choice or a particular framing. And that if you expand that framing to embrace and acknowledge complexity, new approaches based on relationship, trust, and learning become possible and preferable in many instances. Again, in the book, Ray and Ed draw on a number of metaphors to describe this new way of governing and governance. They speak about government as helmswoman steering the boat. They speak about government as a conductor of an orchestra or as part of an orchestra that's improvising. Next slide. A metaphor that I love and often use, which is borrowed from Hilary Cottam, is government as head gardener. She says the role of public servant is no longer that of controlling the mechanical levers. It's that of head gardener, setting out the design, planting, tending, nurturing, and where necessary, weeding. So there are some examples that I've started to discover in Australia of government being more gardener. Next slide, please. One is a conversation that I was part of a few weeks ago with a group of practitioners who are exploring introducing and scaling a personal care or personalised care and social prescribing approach in Australia. At the centre of this is a belief and appreciation that humans are complex, multifaceted beings, and that health well-being extends well beyond the healthcare system. In this model, the role of the doctor is not just to diagnose and prescribe, it's to understand what matters to people, what a good day looks like, and to draw on a range of resources from art therapy to running groups to financial literacy courses to support people to live their best lives. Next slide, please. Another piece of work that I was more closely involved with was with the Australian Taxation Office. We worked together, CPI and the ATO, to explore what would it mean and what would need to happen for the ATO to reimagine itself, not as a tax revenue collection office, but as a steward of the tax and superannuation ecosystem. Through workshops and interviews, we discovered that people understand system stewardship quite differently, but that the enablers and barriers are common across the organisation. And that was a sort of foundational piece that the ATO design team's now taking forward, but I'm really excited to see where that ends up. Next slide, please. I think where Ray and Ed's book goes further in some ways than CPI is in the new institutions, organisations and structures that it proposes to really enable this enabling form of government. And this is definitely something that I'm thinking about in the context of my work and how we might at CPI start to bring this thinking into how we frame and have our conversations. So to finish, I'm really delighted to be part of this conversation. I think that the book offers both a grand vision, but really grounded in some practical ideas and achievable articulation of what different could and should look like. So I'm so pleased to be part of the conversation today about how to take that vision forward. Thanks.
Thea, thank you. More inspiration there. And I love that metaphor of head gardener, and the weeding piece goes so beautifully along with Ed and Ray's notion of a resulter that would help us work out where not to invest, or help government work out where not to invest any longer. Thank you. Ed, I'm going to hand over to you now for reflection and commentary on the contributions from all you've heard so far. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Cynthia. It's very interesting to hear different perspectives come across. I'm very pleased that some of the metaphors, anyway, are working. Although I have to reflect at present that in the UK, we've more or less got government by metaphor. So currently the government are proposing moonshots, circuit breakers, I don't know, flamethrowers. So it's sort of metaphors at the right point. But I think if they work, they can. And linking that to that they're very, very powerful, sorry. And we had this very powerful metaphor in our response to the ozone hole, which by and large worked. We actually responded to that. But the metaphor that was at play there was connected with Star Wars and Darth Vader and this notion of death rays penetrating the ozone shield. And those that have gone back and studied it seemed that this was quite a powerful way of getting people energized and understanding. We've been wrestling long and hard as to what the metaphor might be to get this bigger picture, this immensity of what is occurring. And so far we've come up with the Biosphere Is God. This is not meant to offend anyone who has strong religious convictions, because, well, who could the biosphere be? There isn't by and large a definite, who could a God be, rather, in your religion? There isn't by and large a definition of a God. But if I think in our heads, we started to understand that the biosphere is so important to us that we need to put it on the pedestal and, if you like, make it a god. And nature does have a long history here, but I think we're going to have to get to that. That then links to another point that Bob was making about carbon taxing and just how important the the taxation system, and particularly carbon taxing, is to our gripping with some urgency, and almost overnight stopping things like deforestation and minimizing fossil fuel use and all the rest of it. But one of the points there is that the taxation system drives so much behavior and so much poor behavior, and widening that piece of framing. Some colleagues are saying, well, why do we tax work? What is this income tax? We're actually penalizing people for going to work. Why on earth are we doing that? And their thrust is very much to tax location value, the location value of land, and of course to tax wealth. Why on earth, you might argue that Jeff Bezos' children, Jeff Bezos, sorry, he's earned 174 billion in wealth through an existing system, which is awful and flawed, but nevertheless, it's fair enough. Why on earth should his children have 175 billion? There is absolutely no right, moral, ethic, economic understanding that says that should be the case. So the tax system absolutely has to be overhauled and, well, thought about and overhauled in a very substantial way. The next point of connection on Rupert Murdoch, we love him too. And I've started to list down the things that he's got in the UK for his business. I mean, it started off with a newspaper monopoly. This is in Thatcher's days. It went on to a satellite television monopoly. He was then allowed to buy up the whole of the Premiership football events. He was then, they minimized the number of what they call national events that are broadcast on television. More recently, he's been trying to get 100% financial control. All of this within a corporate governance that is essentially fixed because his family's shares are preferential. All of those things that I pointed out were deals with both Labour and Conservative, either to be prime ministers or sitting prime ministers, in return for his support of his newspapers. And that power of what we call in the book preferential lobbying, which has got a stranglehold and has become, in effect, state capture of some countries. And if you may not be as captured as South Africa, but we're all getting pretty captured by big business and wealth. And that thing of preferential lobbying, which we take as read, oh, it's the way the world works. It is not the way the world has to work. And if we're going to live in harmony with nature and not suffer the apocalypse, then the world is not going to have to work that way. And we set out some quite specific changes that we need to make to constitutions. I mean, the funding of political parties is a screamingly obvious one. Taking decisions in private is perhaps less obvious. The importance then of having an effective independent feedback system within every system of governing, so that we don't have governments pushing out policies, laws, regulations, and all the rest of it. And then, well, often, attention shifts and, well, let's get on to the next law. Well, attention can't shift. We need to know if those laws, policies, programs are working. And it's not about you having self-scoring politicians, governments trying to prove, yes, they got it right. It's about an independent assessment of that. And you start to bring some reality into government. The thing that very much struck me as I was working quite extensively with the new Labour government from 97 to 2010, I was getting more and more into assortments of meetings with ministers and these peers that we have, and officials and big organizations and so on and so forth, spending hours and hours. And some of the early work I did have effect. After a while, it was like, where is the power? Because I'm not seeing it here. There's a lot of discussion, there's a lot of policy making, but how much of this is translating into beneficial impact on the ground? And actually, if you trace it all through, it's very, very little. And this is the irony that I'd like to finish on, that we think that people at the center, the politicians, the officials, they have the power, but often they're as powerless as the rest of us, because these systems of governing, of politics, of economics, of technology have got hold of us, and we're all just dancing within them. And so we've got these 26 principles of systemic governance, is what we call it in the book, which are designed to be taken, to be put into constitutions, to be put into the education system, because as Ray has often pointed out to me, you can have the finest constitution in the world, but if you don't have good performers, then it's not going to work very well. So if you like, that's where our focus has come, to try and conclude and to make something happen with some urgency. Thanks very much.
Ed, thank you. It's impossible to distill all of this into the time that we've given ourselves today. So I really appreciate the brevity and the conciseness from the speakers. As a way of transitioning from the speakers to this second piece, I want to share a metaphor or just a story I've been using for the last few years now to try to get across this idea that there is zero separation between nature and us. And I do this really simply. This is my finger. Or is it? The atoms in this finger, they're not mine. They've been here for about 4 billion years. I'm just borrowing them for a little while. They're going to go off and have a really fun time once I'm gone, or even before that, because of the rate at which our bodies reproduce themselves. The notion that we are separate from the atoms that make us up is just so deeply daft. And this is the kind of critical reflection that we need in order to be able to recognize the depth of the connections between us and the biosphere that sustains us, and the opportunity we have to do things differently, which is where you come in. So this is the participation part. What we're going to do is send you off into breakout rooms of about 5 people. We've got, that means we'll have about 20 or so breakout rooms. These are your instructions. You'll have about 10 minutes or so. What we want you to do in order to come up with a manageable number of questions is together to formulate one rich question to put to the panel. And the idea of this question is that it helps us talk about, in an informed rather than a purely critical way, why our governance systems are not up for what we have to do at this point in our history. So the goal of your question needs to be to help create momentum around how we imbue acts of governance at all levels, wherever we are, with systems thinking and practice capabilities. If you'd like to collaboratively wordsmith, you can do that using the Zoom chat function in your little breakout room, but you need to know that what's in the Zoom chat will disappear into the ether when we press that magic button that brings you back. So you need to copy and paste it in order to be able to pop it in to Mentimeter. Either way, one person in your group needs to stand up and say, okay, it's me, I'm going to craft the question into Mentimeter. So note that website, or I guess we're going to leave this, no, how are we going to do this? We'll send, there's a talk. You can find menti.com, note down 39843 now. Everyone, write down 39843 because you're not going to be able to see this chat when you go into the main function. Okay, so back to the, thank you, to the question slide. I'm hoping that's as clear as mud. You've got about 10 minutes. We want one question per group. We want you to put that into Menti using the code 39843. And in about 10 minutes or so, we will bring everybody back. If you finish earlier, come on back to the main room and you might be able to start the discussion a little bit earlier. Okay, clear as mud. Amber, Tania. Question here, how can we enable key players in the system, including civil servants, to influence changes in public policy and governance and thereby contribute to the much needed renovation and renewal that we, I think we all are probably advocating. So how do we enable key players in the system, including civil servants? Thea, I'm going to throw that one to you, given your role in Nesta and what you've been talking about. What do you think? How?
Yeah. Well, I think that we need changes. If we're talking about new sensibilities and new ways of governing and governance, we need a whole lot of changes at a whole lot of levels. But certainly at CPI, a lot of the work that we do focuses on civil servants and on empowering and supporting them to, as I said in the presentation, I guess understand that new public management paradigm, which is around performance and metrics and control and all the things that we know don't work in complex environments, is a choice. It's not an inevitability. And that there are examples from across the world of governments doing things differently and of civil servants really leading visionary change. So an example we often talk about is the work that Donna Hall led in Wigan in Northern England, where she changed the relationship. Her work was focused on changing the relationship between local government and citizens and training frontline workers, police officers, social workers, everyone in ethnographic methods, because she understood that what matters most in taking a systemic approach to government is having human relationships and hearing human stories. And so I think that you know, she was a bureaucrat. She was not a politician. She worked with politicians. But I could give you another 3 or 4 examples like that of really enlightened public servants creating real change across the world.
Fantastic, thank you. And I'm going to hold you to that offer for the 3 or 4 other examples. We might add those to the responses to questions that we don't get to today. I think that that comment that you made about Donna Hall understanding the core of government being about being aware of and finding ways to relate to people's stories as they experience them is so central. So thank you for that. The next question that we've got here is around creating a bottom-up governance model. And I'm just going to note that I love that all the questions are starting with how. We know that why is central in this piece, and we know that the being piece is all about why. And the question, I have to say, that's the big question that came up for me in the book too, is like, how? So how do we create bottom-up governance model to enable this change to governance? How to make civil society aware of the power that it does have? Bob, I'd be very interested in your reflections on this one. How to create a bottom-up governance model to enable this change?
Well, one can experiment with different approaches. Having place managers, for example, we found during my time as Premier, especially with the challenge of areas with difficult social indicators, having a place manager go in there and being responsible and having the authority to pull together diverse government agencies.
Okay.
So it might have been a suburb which had the highest rate of return of people who'd done time in jail. Very challenging indicators. And we needed to make sure that policing and family support, drug and alcohol services
all working together,
responded to those needs. Talking in terms of place management was relevant. Now that might have been overtaken, that's 15 years old now. It might have been overtaken by different approaches. But it certainly did produce results on the ground in, for example, Cabramatta. It's a long time since we've been confronted with headlines about lousy social indicators in Cabramatta. That was sorted out. Another example of an improved social indicator in Sydney, we felt that Arabic background youth were really presenting us with a set of challenges. Yes, having police be more creative was one part of it, but getting teams in public spaces around railway stations or around Darling Harbour outside the casino to interact with groups of Arabic youth in a non-threatening way, in a cooperative way, steering them away from antisocial behaviour, worked a treat. And we engaged volunteers, community leaders from the Arabic background community to do it. So these are 2 notions: the Arabic Youth Partnership, having place managers. I know these work. It's been a long time since anyone was able to suggest that Arabic background youth were presenting a disproportionate, were making a disproportionate negative contribution to the livability of areas, but that was a commonplace. That was commonplace. And
thank you.
They're 2 examples.
Yeah, no, that's terrific, Bob. I appreciate both of those. And I think that second one in particular, what it speaks to in terms of a systems view of things is the centrality of context in terms of the responses that we come up with. So moving on, I'm interested in this next one that's about how we might change the pathways into politics and deprofessionalize it to make it a more appealing path for more people and to avoid the story that Ray told. Ed, given that you've, as you say, observed government from every single possible angle, I'm wondering whether you might have some thoughts on this one about changing pathways into politics and deprofessionalizing it.
Yeah. It's really interesting. So you have a lot of, women, just getting a reasonable male-female balance, ethnic minorities, but then, all sorts of divisions of class and power. How can we, and indeed just attracting the right sort of people who do the right sort of things and get things done, rather than the egotists, the narcissists, and all the rest of it. Well, I turn around and I say, well, have a look at a place like Switzerland. Switzerland, just tying very quickly back to the last question, has a very strong, as Bob said earlier, has a very strong deliberative democracy, participative democracy, and regular referendums, which can be called because you get a number of signatures on the paper and it goes through a process, and then the citizens of Geneva decide on whether to invest 3.2 million Swiss francs in a park and ride scheme, for example. They have a very decentralized setup, 26 cantons as they're called. They have, who's the Prime Minister or the President of Switzerland, I often ask? You don't know, because they have a President of a Federal Council of 7 who only does the job for 1 year. So here you've got this very decentralized, very democratic system. Guess what? You'll find in general a majority of people on the Federal Council are women. And equally, you'll find, although it's a small council, you'll find greater diversity of other representations. So in other words, if you get the system right, sorry to go on about the system, but if you get the system right, you get the constitution right, you will get the right people coming forward.
Thank you, Ed. I spent quite a bit of time in Switzerland last year, and during that time, I was kind of appalled to find out that the 26th canton to give women the right to vote only did so about 10 years ago. So there are, even in those systems that we hold up, there are limitations. Yeah. So much learning for all of us to do, hey? Ray, obviously you're next, and the question I'd like to pose to you is this one about what are examples of processes for enabling awareness and discussion of these deeper ways of being? That whole idea of pulling out and just getting a little bit more aware of our own values and worldviews and the implications within groups of people, so that everyone might be a little more open to operating in a systemic learning process. I think those of us who have a bit of a process bent, have got our pens poised for your response here. Ray.
Thanks, Cynthia. Yes, well, for 20 years or more now, I've been researching in areas of governance, and particularly river catchment or water governance issues, not only an organisational governance. And we've done a lot of work on what we call social learning. We understand social learning as a means by which people come together with a stake in an issue. They could be citizens in a community, in an electorate, or they could be people who have got a stake in a river catchment. And through engaging together and receiving relevant inputs, exploring, inquiring, create changes in understanding and changes in practices which lead to concerted action amongst the people. And that is the dynamic of social learning. You can understand that a bit like an orchestra or a jazz ensemble, as the metaphors might be. But we understand social learning as more than that. A bit, if we take the orchestra metaphor, the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra is both a process and an entity. You have to invest in it. You have to pay to have it. And at the moment, we underinvest in social learning as a governance mechanism. And if I can just briefly mention one example, here during the lockdown in Victoria, Colac had an outbreak of COVID associated with the local meatworks. A group of local citizens started talking with each other, as citizens do, and decided that they had to act collectively to monitor, control, test, because the central government system was not going to act timely enough to get control of the virus. So they became what we talk about in the book as an exemplar of Ashby's law of requisite variety. You have to have variety to manage variety. And so, and citizens are extremely capable of doing this if you only set up some simple rules, some protocols, some ethics, and other things of behaviour, and you can invest in this. And one of the problems we have, of course, is that in the Westminster system, with ministerial accountability sitting at the top and power running up, you can too often create a set of tram tracks or within government where you have silos where everything runs up rather than running up and out, and they need to be both.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ray. Thea, timely that you've got a call with Colac directly after this. And let me throw another one to you. How do we break down the existing cemented-in structures which seem insurmountable and make sure marginalised groups are proactively engaged in decision-making? I'm wondering whether your experience at both CPI and Nesta might give you some interesting insights on that one. Over to you, Thea.
Yeah, so I think that I might take focus on the second part of that question.
Sure. The marginalised groups.
The marginalised groups, because CPI is doing some really interesting work at the moment on listening. And Nadine, who leads our UK office, has led a project with Engage Britain on listening to the stories of the most marginalised people in the UK, whose voices are generally not heard. So people who are affected by mental illness, sex workers, really, you know, people who are often at the margins and who we forget to listen to. And they've just released a wonderful report where what they talk about is that the language that we use to describe these groups of people are the hard to reach. You know, we're used to that language, the hard to reach people. And and in the report they say what we should actually be calling these people is the seldom heard. And what they discovered through their work was that the process of listening is so empowering for these people. The fact that someone wants to listen to their story, not just once, but 3 times. There was sort of three separate listening sessions and 3 sense-making sessions. And they're moving ahead with the work, and it's funded by philanthropy. But I think that, you know, so it's a team effort. You know, it's philanthropic funding that enables this to happen. It's an organisation and the leadership of someone like Nadine and Engage Britain. But it's actually not that hard. You know, one of the key findings was that giving these people space and time to tell their stories is in and of itself an incredibly powerful thing. And I think we would all be enriched if more of that kind of work was happening.
Thank you. That process of deep listening is one that's of a lot of interest to me. At the International Transdisciplinary Conference last year, when I gave the keynote there, I put these handouts on every single chair. It's mostly academics, but I put these handouts that were all about saying deep listening is actually what we as transdisciplinary researchers ought to be doing at the get-go, if what we say we're trying to do is to understand the situations that people find themselves in order to be able to help to improve things. And it's also what Hugh Mackay calls deeply confronting act to do, because of the structures and constrictions that we put on ourselves around our own worldviews. And for me, that deep listening and the structure, the challenge to our worldviews is so is part of what we need to overcome.
Absolutely. And I just add as well that, you know, that I guess the next step to take it forward, because I can't find the question now, but it's more, it's not just.
It was about marginalised groups, making sure they're proactively engaged in decision making.
Exactly. So the listening is part of that, but the bit that I guess I missed was what, you know, listening is fantastic for all the reasons that I've just described, but then what do you do with that, and how do you bring people into decision-making processes? And there's actually a fantastic book that I've just read, which I'll pop in the chat, called Beyond Sticky Notes, Co-Design for Real. And it's a really, really thoughtful, practical book, which sets out what good co-design looks like. And it moves from listening, which is important, and building trust, because that's the first step in a co-design process, right through to actually what it means to bring these people in, not just as, you know, people who you consult with, but actually who co-design and shape the policy or program. So I'll pop that in the chat now.
Great, thank you. Ray, I'm not sure if you were saying, can I please speak, or that's a great book.
Well, I just want to pick up on what Thea said, which I agree with totally, but and give a plug for Lankelly Chase, which is a foundation in the UK who've done a lot of work in this area, and whose CEO, Julian Corner, is an alumnus of our systems program at the Open University. And so they do some really interesting work.
Ray, can I ask that you make sure you add that in to these notes that we're going to prepare for people, and we'll send out later on in order that we capture it, and we'll take things from the chat and add into that as well. Thank you. Okay, back to these questions. I had one. Where did it go? One about language. Bob, there's a question here about how we often don't have a shared language due to climate change being so political and politicized. Groups often want the same outcome, for example, recovered resilient communities, but our language doesn't help us. So how can systems framing help diffuse the climate change language barrier and build a common language?
Well, that's a mighty relevant question. We've learned that coal-dependent communities, coal-producing communities, don't like the word transition. They don't like the word transition. They don't want anyone to say, we're here to help you with transition, because they rather like the high-paid, full-time jobs they've got. And if you got a coal miner who's getting very well paid to drive a huge heavy vehicle in an open-cut mine site in the Hunter Valley, he does not want to be told that there's some vague job going to be produced in a transition that'll have him working in aged care or tourism. He would say, I don't want a transition. He would say, I like the job I've got. It's well paid, it's full time. I like driving a truck. It's a male job. And don't talk about me being transitioned, something that's vague, likely insecure, and to be a whole lot less well remunerated. So there's a resistance to the word transition, and we ought to be talking instead about economic growth or economic diversification. But here's a warning. Sometimes in society you face clear-cut, head-to-head conflict. And I suspect that is what we've got with climate. The proposition is we price carbon to hasten the transition to the fuels of the future, to the renewables. We price it to get there faster. But there are people who say our jobs, our profits are in carbon, and we want it to last as long as it can. And you're not going to price us. And that proposition has actually won a majority in Australian federal elections. And I don't think any tweaking of the language would have got us away from that clash of interests that produced this policy deadlock over the last 11 years in Australia.
Bob, thank you. It's a really apt point that you make when we're just talking about our capacity for deep listening. And Stuart Waters, I have to give you a shout out. I love your comment in the chat about we've heard of keynote speakers, but we don't hear of keynote listeners. I wonder what that role would look like. I think that's a lovely contribution. We're getting close to time, so I'm going to throw Ed and Ray a ridiculous challenge. Ed, can we apply the French method of Citizens Congress to the Australian situation? Ray, how do we manage a river system like the Murray-Darling via a state-based structure? 25 words or less, please.
The simple answer is yes. And we're trying to do it in the UK. To support that yes, someone once said to me about a year ago, you regard trees as resources, we regard them as relatives. This was Tasmanian Aboriginal. And it stuck in me and I reeled and then I got it. So if we can get people to get that through a citizens' assembly, then that would be great.
Thank you. Ray, closing comment?
Great big question. I worked with the Murray-Darling.
Yes.
It's the simple answer is it's all to do with framing. If it had been framed in 2007, as the Australian Public Service Commission was then talking about as a wicked problem, it may well have made some progress. But it falls back too much onto what we call systematic governance, and it fails to be framed as a coupled co-evolutionary social biophysical system. And it's about the human ongoing relationship between humans and the river system that is at stake. And until we reframe how we think about it and therefore the practices we use to govern it, we're going to be stuck in this mire of politics and exploitation.
Thank you. We could go on and we're out of time. So it's just up to me now to remind people that we will be back in contact. We will send you some information about a new deliberative democracy course that ISF will shortly launch, as well as all of the gems that you've heard today. Thank you to Ed and to Ray for countless hours distilling life's worth of wisdom. Thank you to Thea and Bob for inspiring us with your juxtaposing but beautifully interconnecting viewpoints. Thank you in particular to the people behind the scenes who you don't know about, who made this happen. So Isabel Sebastian, Amber McCulloch and Tennille Jones, well done learning by doing on the run to get us to this point. Thank you. And thanks to all our participants. There is no party if the guests don't show up. So thank you for coming along and for participating and for crafting some wonderful questions. To close, I'm going to pick up on something that Thea said in our conversation beforehand, talking about how the world is so unstable now and it's so very hard to predict. And I would say, therefore, there was never a greater opportunity or a greater need for us to nudge, to influence, particularly towards systemic understanding, to argue for a different approach wherever we find ourselves, whether that's in the kitchen, in the park, in the office, around the boardroom table, wherever we are. We are the people who can make a change. Thank you.